Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you could all join us here and that I can be here, that I was invited to. I can't think of a more timely event at this moment than cancel culture and free speech, which implicates and involves us all. And if you haven't had a chance to read Ilya Shapiro's book, Lawless, you can see I actually have read it, and it is fantastic, and it's really interesting. This is the 11th event that has been put on by the Alumni Free Speech Association, and if you've been to other ones, you know the quality of them, how much you learn, and how open-ended they are and committed not to pushing any specific ideas, but allowing people to think and hear a variety of voices. So I'm excited to hear what Mr. Shapiro says, and then we will, after that, have time for Q&A. So as you're listening to what he says, please think of questions. You know, we're obviously here to draw from his wisdom and not anybody else's, so let's have questions that try to draw him out in what he's trying to say. I've been asked to read a little warning, which is the North Carolina Restore and Preserve Free Speech Act, passed by the North Carolina General Assembly in July 2017, requires the university to protect the rights of the audience to see and hear the event and to protect the right of the speakers to be heard and seen, regardless of their viewpoints. Any person who disrupts the event or interferes with the rights of those in attendance to hear or see the speakers will be asked to leave. Not by me. Anyone who does not leave when asked or does not put down signs which obstructs the audience's view will be removed and may be subject to arrest. Okay, so don't do that. It is my pleasure to introduce John Bruce, who is the chairman of the board of directors for the Alumni Free Speech Association at UNC. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance, I welcome you to tonight's program. First thing I want to do is thank our co-sponsors to help make this event possible. That's the UNC Student Free Speech Alliance and the UNC Federalist Society. Peter did not really take time to introduce himself. He's Peter Zane, formerly of the New York Times and book editor of the News Observer and columnist in the News Observer, but now the editor of Real Clear Investigations. And if you're not familiar with the work that they do, you should become so. They're great. Okay, UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance is a mouthful, so just call us UNC AFSA. That will help you remember our very simple URL for our website, which is uncafsa.org. uncafsa.org. Please go there and subscribe. It's free to subscribe. We will not fill up your inbox with requests for money, but we will send you interesting newsletters about the latest news on the free speech front and about our upcoming programs. Our next program is on November 4th. I think it'll be in this room, but stay tuned to our website about that. And that will be a debate on the merits of the Trump administration's policies toward universities. When you go to our website, you will see a Donate tab. Why should you click on that? To help us defend free speech, viewpoint diversity, and academic freedom at UNC. We do that by putting on great programs like the one tonight, by interfacing with leaders at UNC. We had a meeting with the Chancellor this afternoon with Professor Shapiro. And we also serve as a watchdog for free speech rights at UNC and an advocate for viewpoint diversity. We're a nonpartisan 501c3 organization, so please consider giving generously to support our efforts. 12 days ago, Charlie Kirk was assassinated while he was engaged in the exact thing that UNC advocates, which is participating in open and civil discourse on the important issues of our time. Charlie said, when people stop talking, that's when you get violence. Let's observe a moment of silence for Charlie Kirk. Now I'm delighted to bring up Hunter Closty to introduce our featured speaker. Hunter is the president of the UNC Student Free Speech Alliance at UNC. In addition, he serves as editor-in-chief of the Carolina Review, which is UNC's long-standing independent student news publication. He's currently it says here, third-year student. To me, that's a junior. He's pursuing a double major in econ and contemporary European studies. And this past summer, he was an intern for the editorial board of the New York Post. Not the Washington Post or the New York Times, but the New York Post. So, Hunter, take it away.
It is my pleasure to introduce Ilya Shapiro, one of America's most prominent commentators on constitutional law and higher education. He is a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute and serves as a contributing editor of City Journal. Before that, he led the Georgetown Center for the Constitution and spent more than a decade at the Cato Institute, where he directed constitutional studies and oversaw the Cato Supreme Court Review. Mr. Shapiro is the author of several important books. His latest, Lawless: The Miseducation of America's Elites, published this year, takes a critical look at how our leading universities have abandoned principles of free inquiry and the rule of law, and what that means for our democracy. His earlier works include Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominees and the Politics of America's Highest Court, and Religious Liberties for Corporations. In addition to his books, Mr. Shapiro has filed hundreds of briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court, testified before Congress and state legislatures, and written for leading outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the LA Times, USA Today, and the National Review. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ilya Shapiro.
Is that on? Great. All right. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. This is the closest thing in my closet to Carolina blue. It's a Declaration of Independence tie, but I hope it'll do for this occasion. Thanks so much for having me to discuss these important issues. I think we all recognize that there's a crisis in higher education, one that was thrust into the national discourse nearly 2 years ago, after October 7th. It's amazing that the heart of anti-Semitism in America lies on campus, among the most educated and so-called progressive people in the country. As Bill Ackman, the billionaire donor and activist, put it in a revelatory essay that came out the same day that Harvard president Claudine Gay resigned, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, a warning about larger issues. It's a leading indicator of underlying pathologies, which here means everything from cancel culture to indoctrination. I don't know, do I even need this mic? Probably gets in the way with the photographer here. I think this is fine. Do we need this mic? No? Good. Historically, wherever anti-Semitism has flared up, it's a signal that there's something going on not good below the surface. And in today's academic culture context, that means everything from cancel culture to indoctrination, intellectual corruption to moral decay. We've seen a subversion of the core mission of universities to seek truth and knowledge, and of classical liberal values like free speech, due process, equality under the law. It's been a shift from education to activism. The root cause of all of this is a noxious postmodern ideology that contends that truth is subjective and needs to be viewed through lenses of race, gender, and other identity categories, according to some privilege hierarchy. Your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed. Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of Berkeley Law, wrote in October 2023 that as a 70-year-old Jewish man, quote, "Never in my life have I seen or felt the anti-Semitism of the last few weeks." Well, some of us were less surprised, given the anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally anti-Western ideology that's proliferated in higher education. Indeed, some of us have a lived experience with this sort of thing. This warm reception that you've given me is very different than one that I got when I tried to speak at UC Law SF, the school formerly known as UC Hastings, on March 1st, 2022. The response I got from the students there was basically, shut up, cleaned up for polite company. They prevented the event from taking place, chanting and banging like it was an Occupy Wall Street meeting. It was the first time that I'd ever been disrupted in more than 1,000 public speaking events. And it's a damning indictment of the state of public discourse at a time when a toxic cloud has enveloped all of our public life. Although the FedSoc chapter there, the Federalist Society chapter there, had invited me to discuss the subject of my previous book, The Politics of Judicial Nominations, which became all the more timely when Justice Breyer announced his retirement, alas, a heckler's veto prevailed, applying a bad faith lens to a poorly phrased tweet in which I criticized President Biden's nomination criteria for the Supreme Court opening. Activists called me a racist misogynist and my expertise illegitimate. Specifically, back in January of 22, I criticized the president's decision to limit his candidate pool by race and sex. I argued that if I were a Democratic president, I would choose the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, Sri Srinivasan, happens to be an Indian-American immigrant, that he would be the best choice, meaning that everyone else was less qualified by basic operation of logic. So, if Biden kept his campaign promise, he would pick what, given Twitter's character limit, I inartfully characterized as a lesser black woman. Now, I later deleted that tweet. It was poorly phrased, but still think that Biden should have considered all possible candidates, as 76% of Americans agreed in a poll conducted by that rabid right-wing outlet, ABC News. I was suspended from my job at Georgetown's Center for the Constitution, an important center, we learned, because the rest of the law school is the center against the Constitution, pending an investigation into whether I violated university policies on harassment and anti-discrimination. Maybe I was harassing President Biden, I'm not sure exactly. But now, in San Francisco, the students who shut down my event wanted to hear neither about the president's selection criteria, nor my broader analysis of the confirmation battle to come now that there was an actual nominee. And they did so in the vilest language imaginable, which I'm not going to repeat here. Several times, literally getting in my face and physically blocking access to the lectern. The protesters also castigated their own school for allowing me to speak and called for diverse student representatives to approve speakers, plus, of course, mandatory training in critical race theory. Never mind that Hastings, as a public institution, would be violating the First Amendment if it disapproved speakers based on the content of their speech. And never mind that, as one of the deans advised in the few minutes when they weren't chanting and banging, I'd stepped outside to confer with my student hosts about what we were going to do, and I said, look, you're paying for me to be here for an hour, I'll stand here for an hour, I'll see what happens. But during that time, the academic dean gave a warning about that it was against school policy to disrupt a duly invited speaker. As the school's chancellor pointed out in an email the next day, quote, disrupting an event to prevent a speaker from being heard is a violation of our code of student conduct, which the college will, indeed must, enforce. But it wasn't enforced, and nobody was disciplined. Now, you'd think that law students would have a greater appreciation for engaging with controversial ideas than undergrads. After all, I don't know if there's any lawyers or law students in the audience, probably, but when I talk to law students about this, I say, spoiler alert, you're going to have much more challenging issues or events in your legal careers than speakers you don't like. But my experience was no isolated incident, not even for that 1 month of March of 22. The following week, a similar thing happened at Yale, ironically over a panel bringing together lawyers from left and right who agreed on little other than the importance of free speech. Then it happened again at Michigan when students obstructed a debate on Texas's heartbeat bill. And then a year later, now 2 years ago, was the shutdown of Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford. The only thing these events had in common was that they featured non-progressive speakers. We've gotten to a place where questioning, say, affirmative action or abortion is outside the academic Overton window, the permissible range of policy views. Now, it's all well and good to adopt strong speech policies. Many universities have those, at least on paper or pixels. But it's not enough if administrators aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. Some universities don't even realize how legally exposed they are, and that their own speech policies are a big part of the problem. Private universities aren't bound by the First Amendment, but they are bound by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, at least those that accept federal funds, to enforce their policies in a way that doesn't discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. But many schools have speech policies that are inconsistent, vague, and in some cases illegal on their face. Consider, for example, the University of Pennsylvania and Northwestern, two schools that have been the focus of congressional hearings and federal investigations, and whose presidents both resigned in the last couple of years. Penn's code of conduct said that students have a right, quote, to freedom of thought and expression, and that the content of student speech or expression is not by itself a basis for disciplinary action. But the handbook also goes on to say that, quote, student speech may be subject to discipline when it violates university regulations or policies. Nowhere is it made clear when speech violates those regulations or policies. Northwestern's handbook is even worse. A section titled Demonstration Policy explains that Northwestern, quote, welcomes the expression of ideas, including viewpoints that may be considered unorthodox or unpopular. But it also informs students that it, quote, expects community members to report incidents of biased speech or conduct, which it defines by reference to the, quote, power and privilege differential of individuals based on their identity group membership. Moreover, although the handbook first says that Northwestern's bias incident response team is non-punitive, it goes on to explain that, quote, where an additional response is required by university policy, law, or requested by the reporter, the team will route the report to the appropriate authorities, thereby seeming to leave punishment very much on the table for speech. To the extent that Northwestern is defining and then punishing bias based on the racial or ethnic identities of those involved, its policy violates Title VI on its face. Adding to the confusion is now former President Michael Schill's statement to the campus community indicating that new policies would be forthcoming to combat, quote, speech that harms members of our community, especially forms of identity-based hate. Now, my colleagues at the Manhattan Institute, Chris Rufo and Ryan Thorpe, had a smashing expose of all sorts of civil rights violations at Northwestern in City Journal last month, and I will commend that to you. It's really astonishing stuff. But the problem isn't just that universities have poorly written policies. It's that such policies are likely to lead to discriminatory enforcement. Universities are too one-sided to be able to enforce ambiguous and vague policies in a neutral way. The bodies conducting disciplinary reviews and issuing judgments tend to have faculty, administrators, and students with ideologically homogeneous viewpoints. Faculty are much more left-leaning than the general public. Some studies finding that fewer than 10%, far fewer, of faculty self-identify as conservative. In one survey of liberal arts college faculty, the ratio of Democrats to Republicans was 13-1, and in some disciplines, anthropology, communication, sociology. Most students can graduate without encountering a single Republican professor. Now, students are more ideologically diverse, but those who serve on disciplinary committees are not likely to be a random draw of the student body and may be unwilling to publicly express dissenting views. That possibility was laid bare when the student government at Dartmouth voted 13-2 in a public vote of no confidence in their president after her forcible removal of pro-Palestinian encampments. In a later secret ballot, the vote was 9-8 against the motion. Social science research suggests that viewpoint diversity is critical to impartial group decision-making. It makes for better, more informed decisions, less groupthink. For example, different expertise and political opinion temper jury bias and ensure fair treatment of the accused. Biases are likely more pronounced among those serving in adjudicative capacities in higher ed, and yet there's no screening to remove those with fixed prejudices, no instructions from a judge, and the rules of evidence are lax if existing at all. University review panels are not designed to be made up of a jury of your peers or a representative group of students, faculty, and administrators. Indeed, under some university processes, there may be no panel at all, but only a single investigator to write the rules, file complaints, investigate them, determine guilt, and prescribe punishment. That was my case. After a 4-month investigation, finally a junior associate at Wilmer-Hale, this white shoe, very expensive law firm that Georgetown hired to help them out, looked at the calendar and found what lawyers call a jurisdictional defect. Georgetown reinstated me on the technicality that I wasn't an employee when I tweeted. So none of the policies even applied. But the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA, set me up for discipline the next time that I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. They said in a 10-page terse report that I got in my inbox later that afternoon after the dean reinstated me, that if I offended someone again, I'd create a, quote, hostile educational environment. Now, after considering that report and consulting with trusted advisors, my lawyer, Professor Randy Barnett, who hired me, my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us, I concluded that remaining in my job was untenable. I simply could not do what I was hired to do, either inward-facing, teaching student programs, or outward-facing, advocating for originalism, writing articles, going on TV to talk about constitutional theory. Undoubtedly, I would say something that offended someone, and I'd be back in that inquisition. So instead of participating in that slow-motion firing, I resigned. What Georgetown subjected me to, what it would have subjected me to had I stayed, is, to mix metaphors, a heckler's veto leading to a star chamber. Live not by lies, warned Solzhenitsyn. Let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. That became my mantra. I couldn't live that way, and so I made what lawyers call a noisy exit, publishing my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal, as one does, announcing my move to the Manhattan Institute on Fox News, as one does, and have been using this platform I've been given that I didn't seek, this spotlight, to shine a light on the rot in academia. That fall of 22, when Justice Thomas withdrew from teaching at GW, it was just one more example of the poisonous atmosphere in academia that makes it impossible to have a free exchange of ideas. GW administrators rightly stood up to the mob that demanded that he be canceled for his vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, but the fact that they needed to make that statement showed how they'd failed to instill a culture of open inquiry and truth-seeking. It's a shame that Justice Thomas felt the need to withdraw, and a stark contrast to what was going on at Harvard at the same time, celebrating the return of Justice Breyer. Now, I'm generally optimistic about America, and perhaps we're past peak woke generally in society. But we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of higher education. And that's particularly dangerous in law schools, which train the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. And I do mean illiberal. I want to be clear about this point. I'm not arguing or presenting just the latest iteration of a decades-long conservative complaint about liberal faculty bias. Indeed, those hippies who took over the faculty lounge, the Berkeley free speech movement, would now be considered retrograde white supremacists by today's activists. And all of that has been accentuated, enabled by weak leaders who placate this illiberal left that now drives campus culture. University officials facilitate and even foment social justice mobs, while everyone else keeps their head down to keep out of the cancellation crossfire. And that's largely a story of growing bureaucracies. We'll get to the ideological red meat in a moment, but you really have to understand structures and systems. This is an insight from critical theory that's actually valid. The statistics on the growth of these left-skewed non-teachers are mind-boggling. In the quarter century ending 2010, administrative positions swelled by 60%, 10 times that of tenured faculty. The number of university employees who don't teach grew at twice the rate of students, while tuition more than tripled. Since then, the growth in bureaucracies has outpaced that of faculties and students by an even greater rate. It's hard to measure across the board because there's a bit of a shell game in how these things are counted. But the trends are particularly acute in so-called elite places. Yale's administration ballooned by nearly 50% from 2003 to 21, 3 times faster that of the undergraduate student body. At Stanford, the number of administrators grew by 30% from 2017 to 22 alone. So the school now has twice as many non-teaching staff as undergrads, 6 times the number of administrators as faculty. Similar ratios at MIT. The joke is that 100 years ago, Yaleys came to campus with their own personal butler, and now we're trying to provide that same level of service. In effect, students and families are paying a lot more to subsidize a class of well-paid bureaucrats. And as we've seen, administrators are even more radical than professors. One survey found that 40% of administrators self-identify as far left. What once were technocratic paper pushers, ensuring compliance with regulations, have become enforcers of racialism and gender ideology. Now, bureaucrats' incentive, if you read social science literature, whether you're talking about public sector, corporate HR offices, nonprofit, in this case the educational sector, their incentive is always to justify and expand their authority, grow their empires, build their budgets out, which in academia means that apparatchiks with no connection to teaching or research chill speech and eviscerate due process. So whatever problems we have with faculty, and again, we'll get there, this bureaucratic side is really the tail that wags the dog. And after all, the faculty has outsourced things like orientation and culture setting and all of these student services to this class of professional. Okay, having gained a sense for the overall trends, let's focus on DEI. A 2021 survey of 65 large universities that represent 16% of all students at four-year institutions, basically the old Power 5 football conferences. Now we kind of have 2.5 with other things hanging out, but anyway, 65 large universities, 16% of all students, found that the average school has more than 45 people devoted to DEI, which is more than the average number of history professors. At the University of Michigan, which is sort of the league leader, at least was until this past January, what happened then, we're kind of in a period of flux, but hopefully that was the high point. At Michigan, 261 people had a full-time authority over DEI, double that if you include part-time, at a cost of more than $30 million a year annually. Now think about spending that money if you really care about underprivileged students or what have you on tutoring services or scholarships or what have you, but no, it's this. DEI has been the fastest growing segment of the educational bureaucracy, with staffs on average 4 times larger than those that provide legally mandated accommodations for students with disabilities. And to be clear, this study excludes people whose primary role is in compliance with legally required mandates, civil rights laws, Title IX, equal employment opportunity, the sorts of things that were on campus when I was in college more than 25 years ago. An inordinate number of DEI offices have been created or filled in the last decade, especially since the so-called racial reckoning set off by the killing of George Floyd. Again, none of this is legally required. And the sad or ironic or sardonic aspect of all of this is they fail on their own terms. Campus climate surveys show that student satisfaction, sense of belonging, inclusion generally, and comfort with diversity of various kinds specifically, is inversely correlated with the size of DEI offices. The real danger is that universities no longer focus on free inquiry in pursuit of knowledge. Instead, they deploy an army of non-teaching educrats that either distracts from that mission by providing therapeutic coddling or actively prevents truth-seeking by enforcing an ideological orthodoxy. Having staff organize students' social lives and hold their hands while processing the trauma of election results that they don't like infantilizes the young adults who should be training for the workplace and the public square. Having them organize trainings, rallies, and struggle sessions to enforce narrow perspectives on race, sex, class, and other categories prevents the development of critical thinking skills that students need to become well-adjusted professionals. It also shifts power away from faculty and gives it to political commissars whose goals, whose professional training diverges from long-held higher education values. DEI offices have broadened terms like harassment and discrimination, as well as therapeutic terms like harm and safety, right? Words are violence. Not to promote equal opportunity or a welcoming campus environment, but to advance progressive ideology. DEI administrators enforce an orthodoxy that in a quite Orwellian way, in contrast to the dictionary or even kind of commonsensical definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion, stifles intellectual diversity, undermines equal opportunity, and excludes dissenting voices. The behavior of Stanford's DEI dean in egging on the mob against Judge Duncan was illustrative of how these regimes are antithetical to universities' basic missions. If some of you have read then Dean, now Provost Jenny Martinez's memo after that Stanford incident, it's probably the best recent exposition by a university leader of free speech values and academic freedom. But I disagree, and I commend it to you. You should read that 10-page memo. But I think she gets it wrong when she says that the problem was that DEI was done wrong. That DEI done right reinforces free speech values, etc. I just don't think that's the case, at least not anywhere that it's ever been practiced. Then there's the shift from education to indoctrination. When I was in law school in the early 2000s, which sometimes feels like just yesterday, and sometimes feels like a planet far away, long time ago, critical legal studies with its Hegelian and culturally Marxist discourse, well, that was a spent force. We had heard about it. It was something from the 80s and early 90s, and then had been relegated to some dark niche of the sociology department. But now the crits are back, and not just in sociology or literature departments. Regardless of what's going on in K-12 or even undergraduate teaching, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw have eclipsed William Blackstone and Louis Brandeis as avatars of legal education. That shift, when coupled with the bureaucratic growth I've described, has led institutions to prioritize activism over inquiry, seeking social justice rather than truth. So I'm pessimistic that anything will change at any school where academic freedom isn't supported, where rules against hecklers' vetoes, takeovers of academic buildings, and encampments that block student access aren't followed. Too few administrators follow the example of the late University of Chicago president Bob Zimmer, who, when it was demanded that he punish Professor Dorian Abbott for expressing criticism of the university's affirmative action policies, said, look, we're not in the speech police business. If you don't like what a professor has to say, write a letter to the editor of the school paper, have a blog post, have a protest, but don't come to me. I'm not going to evaluate faculty speech. Too few university leaders follow the example of Vanderbilt Chancellor Daniel Diermeier, who just last year, it's a very low bar to get national plaudits for being an educational leader. He ejected and expelled students that had assaulted security guards and taken over his office. This is the exception that proves the rule. One thing that gives me, I won't say optimism, I'll say less pessimism, some hope, is that wherever leaders stand up for the core mission of any academic institution, the mob disperses. But most presidents and deans and department chairs are spineless cowards. They're generally not woke radicals or social justice warriors. They're careerist bureaucrats who have succeeded in climbing the greasy pole and managing and responding to the incentive matrix that's presented to them. And they've been unwilling to confront the illiberal inmates who have taken over their institutions. Statements about academic freedom, declining to fire Supreme Court justices, that's just not enough. They have to instill a culture of respect for opposing views and enforce policies against disruptions of student programs, educational programs. I've been talking about these issues a lot since my lived experience, and often law school deans are in the audience. They come up to me afterwards and they say, okay, I get this whole disruption versus protest thing. We're going to enforce our policies better. Okay, what else can I do? And, at a certain level, it's kind of simple. Don't just depend on the Free Speech Alliance or the Federalist Society to bring in the only speakers that present any sort of alternative viewpoint. There has to be a president's or a dean's speaker series or a regular series of faculty debates of controversial issues to model what it is to engage in civil discourse among professionally trained adults. This also means dismantling DEI bureaucracies that undermine classical liberal values and ending loyalty oaths in the form of diversity statements. Presidents and deans, it turns out, are really good at instilling whatever values they want, whatever campus culture they want, be that public service, social justice, entrepreneurship, whatever it is. And they can do that, and they should do that, for open inquiry and civil discourse. Now, when I left Georgetown a little over 3 years ago, I wasn't holding my breath at the prospect for reform. But maybe now we're finally seeing a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. It can't be done from within. It's not really a matter of presenting a more reasonable, different kind of argument to internal decision makers. So we need external controls from state legislators and attorneys general, congressional oversight. We saw the effectiveness of those education committee hearings bringing up series of university presidents. And yes, executive branch actions tied to federal funding. You're going to have an event on this in November, and that's great. But for too long, there's been no oversight of the existing strings on federal funding. For example, civil rights laws, Title VI, is very robust. The law says that if an academic institution that receives federal funds discriminates based on protected categories, denies equal educational opportunity, they're aware of certain things going on and show indifference to it, ignore Supreme Court rulings on not having racial preferences in admissions, all of these sorts of things, then all of their federal funding can be paused, withheld. There is no germaneness or proportionality requirement. That is, let's say rogue administrators do, in the admissions office, violate the rule against racial preferences. Yeah, your medical research funds can be in jeopardy. That's how seriously Congress decided to take civil rights. And there's been no oversight of that sort of thing for decades. We can talk more about that if you have questions about the specifics of this administration's actions, but again, you're going to have a whole event about that later. And we also need exogenous shocks, what economists call kind of external asymmetric shocks to the system, like the boycott by a dozen federal judges of Yale and Stanford for clerk hiring until they improve their campus cultures, plus employers shying away from hiring those who support Hamas, or who scream at federal judges that they hope their daughters are raped. And we need public exposure. This is another thing that gives me some less pessimism. In February of 2023, after the Wall Street Journal published John Saylor's expose, John lives here in North Carolina. He's now become my colleague at the Manhattan Institute, our head of higher education policy, but he started using FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, to get documents from public schools across the country and their hiring practices for faculty. And this first op-ed in the Journal found that Texas Tech used academic job applicants' diversity statements as litmus tests for hiring economists, biologists, all over the place. The very next day, the chancellor of the university announced that it would end this practice, that this was not appropriate. He's done this again and again. It's a wonderful thing to watch. And my other colleague, Chris Rufo, and his team of investigative reporters has been a multiplier effect in that regard. This is very much low-hanging fruit. They don't even hide it. Claudine Gay, Harvard's former president, crystallizes the larger problem. She's a mediocre academic who was elevated for advancing progressive orthodoxy while checking intersectional boxes. She's the apotheosis of an anti-intellectual movement that prizes DEI, identity, and activism over truth-seeking merit and education. That movement is designed to prefer commissars over scholars. But her resignation didn't end that university's troubles, all these resignations that we've seen. Harvard is still plagued by a toxic campus culture, ideological corruption, bureaucratic bloat that stifle open inquiry and free discourse. To be fair, they have improved. For the first couple of years after her resignation, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, one of my favorite organizations that I've never worked for, but they're basically taken up the mantle of the old ACLU. They defend everybody's speech rights. And they, for a couple of years, named Harvard the worst school in the country for free speech, labeling it abysmal. I think it was the only one with a negative score. Well, good news. This year they've improved. Harvard is 245th out of 257. So good for them. But wherever Harvard is on that and other measures, it's by no means alone. Look, it doesn't take long to destroy reputations built over decades and even centuries. And I know UNC is the nation's oldest public higher education institution. The question now is whether higher ed grandees are willing to do the work to restore their tarnished stature. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle's been joined. Thanks very much, and I look forward to dodging or answering your questions.
So I think we're going to give you an opportunity to line up and ask questions of Professor Shapiro. So you can start to do that. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I don't see mics. Where are they supposed to line up?
I think he's going to...
So just go to the front of the rug, I guess, right? Okay.
Front of the rug. So thank you, that was fascinating. And one of the things I think as a first step can be much more robust government action. As we know, the government has long had strings attached to the money that is provided to universities. So how can we, though, trust, or where's your confidence come that we can trust the efforts to clamp down on universities in a more conservative direction won't just spill over into the line of just the right being as bad as the left has been?
Well, I don't want them to go in a conservative direction. I want them to go into an intellectually honest direction of academic integrity. But look, almost everything that the federal government does in education is unconstitutional because it's not an enumerated power. So we're living in a second-best world. Given that the government is involved, what can we do about it? And we can enforce the letter of the law. So some of what the Trump administration has done, particularly this past spring when they just issued demand letters to Columbia and Harvard, I think they're pretty obvious process fouls. That is, these statutes, and there's not just a technicality, once you have a statutory scheme, there are certain procedures to follow before you can withdraw that funding or eligibility for student loans or what have you. Which is ultimately what they've pursued after launching investigations for a couple of months, then they have a bill of complaint, and then you seek remedies for those kinds of complaints. So setting aside the process fouls, there might be zealousness and whatnot, but for too long, universities have failed in their basic mission of ensuring civil rights, of which free speech is among them. You don't need new legislation to add, more federal strings. These strings are all over the place. Accounting standards to prevent waste and fraud. For that matter, some of the demands from the administration go to checking for plagiarism. That's a type of academic fraud. I think that's within statutory bounds. Other things might be questionable, like requiring complete ideological balance. What does that even mean? What is a Republican physicist versus a Democratic physicist? Or is it balance among theories of quantum mechanics? It's unclear what viewpoint diversity means in that context. But generally, good faith effort not to screen out people who think differently than you. And even without malice, even without saying, oh, anyone to the right of Chuck Schumer is, anathema, there can be an inherent bias, and this is another useful insight from critical theory. That is, we have to check ourselves that we're not just picking people who look like us. It's not just about race and sex, but it's also about people who think like us and work in academic subspecialties like us. So you're naturally inclined to people who you think are kind of like you, especially if you think that you're going to mentor them, their younger versions, all of this sort of thing. So there has to be active counterbalancing of this. Where is the federal authority to enforce those kinds of guidelines? That is less clear than what we're talking about with DEI offices or admissions offices or universities looking askance when a student rights to study in the library are being violated and things like that. So do I worry about overreach? Absolutely. Whenever government is involved, that's a concern in any field, and that's just the federal government. We can talk about what state legislatures are doing as well. But if we're going to have federal laws, if we're going to have federal funds, then this is the long overdue oversight.
So you actually, one really interesting idea, if I'm understanding it correctly, is you said that a lot of the federal government's involvement in education is unconstitutional, and specifically. I'm thinking Christopher Caldwell's terrific book, The Age of Entitlement, and he wrote a lot about the Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65, and how they introduced government authority that has led to a lot of the DEI regimes and so forth that we would not have had otherwise if we just had the Constitution as it had been before. So, as a thought experiment, would we be better off at this point if we just did away with Title VI, Title IX, left people to the freedom of their ways, or is the system itself so corrupt that it's not self-correcting without dangerous government intervention?
Section 5 of the 14th Amendment allows Congress to legislate in ways to enforce the protections of equal protection, due process, privileges, or immunities. And that's the real authority here. So just like the morally bankrupt election regimes in the Jim Crow South allowed federal oversight, receivership, to continue the bankruptcy analogy, of those political systems to enforce voting rights. Similarly, I would argue that given the state of academia, there can be Section 5 authority to enforce civil rights there. That's a little different than federal funding for programs, but at least in terms of civil rights, that is the hook, not interstate commerce or something else.
So, go right ahead, sir. He's got a...
Okay. I guess I'm the guinea pig here.
Remember, there are no stupid questions, just stupid questioners.
Okay, remember you said that. As a constitutional lawyer, I assume you're familiar with the unitary executive theory. Do you support it? If so, what are the pros and cons of that theory, and how does it apply in the current situation that's happening right now in the United States?
Well, I'll take the last part of your question to get us back to our topic, to say how does it apply to education regulation and higher ed and things like that. So unitary executive theory is not about the scope of executive power. It's about the relative scope of executive power vis-a-vis the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and indeed how the power is exercised within the executive branch, whatever its proper scope. And the idea is that the president is the head of the executive branch, and everybody in the executive branch reports to him. And so it's a unified executive. Now, we have certain statutory protections for civil service and other things that Congress has legislated that's part of our law, which means that the president signed it or Congress overrid the veto. In any event, the president's power is not limitless. It's what the Constitution says. The Congress has the power, the judiciary has the power to say that something the president does is unconstitutional, things like that. So I generally agree that the president is the head of the executive branch. He or she and the vice president are the only ones who are elected to head up the executive branch. And so there's something odd if some part of the executive branch is doing something, enforcing the law, executing the law in a way that differs from the president's policy priorities. Again, that doesn't mean that the president rules by diktat, and all of our federal statutory schemes have all these sorts of provisions. I talked about how to pause federal or withdraw federal funding, there has to be an investigation and findings and then all of that sort of thing. It's not just the education secretary or the president or the undersecretary or assistant secretary of education for higher ed that makes these determinations. There's a process. I think for too long we've had these kind of extant parts of the executive branch that are authorities unto themselves and not accountable through our constitutional structures to the president and therefore to the people. And I think we're on a correction course for that. Just today, in fact, the Supreme Court granted cert, took up a case about the removal authority of, in this case, it's a member of the National Labor Relations Board, but all of these so-called independent agencies, which belong to the fourth or fifth or sixth branch of government, even though at least the Constitution that I carry around in my pocket, and I have one in every jacket pocket, I don't just move this around, but it only provides for three branches.
Thank you, Mr. Shapiro, for appearing today, and I'll see you tomorrow at the law school lunch event as well.
That's a plug. At the law school tomorrow, I'll be discussing campaign finance, and specifically there's a case at the Supreme Court this term about restrictions on coordination between candidates and parties.
My question is what is the logical outgrowth if institutions aren't able to uphold the freedom of speech principles that they attempt to reconcile with other separating parts of of ideologies? Is it the cease of the institution model, or will something else take its place? What do you think would be the solution?
I think we're in a period of flux. Some higher ed institutions are in decline and are going to continue to be in decline. Some will stop the bleeding and change their culture, restructure, and improve. We're at a historically low level of public trust in higher education institutions. That's not a good thing. We should want healthy universities to create knowledge, to make new advances, to generate ideas, to be the place where open debate is had. That's the luxury of being in an academic setting. You can discuss and debate and try to create new kinds of knowledge for its own sake. And we've gotten very much away from that. I mean, these have become places that are the most hidebound and echo chambery. That's not good. They're literally not serving their purpose at all. And so, we've seen marginal adjustments. Applications here, elsewhere in the Southeast are up. Applications and donations in Northeastern schools are down. I call this the problem of the cold and the scold. So people are seeking better climate, both meteorological and ideological. That dynamic's going to change. Now, mind you, Harvard has a $63 billion endowment. Even if some of it's not liquid and what have you, that buys you a lot of cushion. But not all schools have that. And even the Harvards of the world, they notice a 5% decline in alumni giving or applications. They understand compound interest. They don't want to make that into a trend. So, savvy university leaders will take note. And those that are too much in their echo chambers will further decline.
In the meantime, as he comes over, are you a free speech absolutist? Because I think one of the things when you have a First Amendment is it actually creates space in the community to say this is not against the law, but this is not acceptable. Should there be any limits on that? I mean, the obvious example is don't say the N-word, don't say, disparaging things. Obviously, someone has the right to say that, but doesn't it have some strength from limiting certain abusive, nasty things that people can say to each other in polite company?
The only thing that I'm absolute on is the correctness of my wife's opinions. Sometimes I disagreed, but it later turns out I was wrong. So, even though I'm a lawyer, at least I play one on TV, not all problems have legal solutions, and not all problems can be of clashes of speech can be resolved by tapping a sign saying First Amendment. Even within the First Amendment, not all speech is protected. I gave a talk earlier today. I was on a panel at Duke Law about free speech on campus, and I talked about the 3 buckets for analyzing issues that come up. So things that are not speech. So if you commit assault or vandalism, even if it's for a politically expressive motive or an artistic motive, you don't get a First Amendment exemption from a charge that you assaulted somebody because you don't like their ideas or something. Then there's unprotected speech, true threats, incitement of violence. There are high bars that's all been litigated. There's clear doctrine about, it has to be imminent and direct threat and things like that. And then there's time, place, and manner regulations. So even core protected First Amendment speech, political views, I can't go into your neighborhood in the middle of the night and with a bullhorn tell you exactly what I think of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That's disturbing the peace, things like that. So there's no such thing as there are no absolute rights, and totally there's room to say you have a right to say that, but that's I'm going to judge you based on that, or as I said, I'm not going to hire you in my law firm if you want to support people who kill innocent lives or what have you. So there's room for civil society, and I wish we were more about civil society than just governmental rules and things.
Thank you so much for your what you've shared with us. 2 quick questions. Tonight is Rosh Hashanah, and many of my Jewish friends could not come. Are you going to make this available? It will be?
Well,
Okay.
it's being recorded. It's not up to me. I'm fully hereby declare that you can broadcast it wherever you like. In fact, I encourage that. And yeah, I guess I'm Jewish. I'm doing some Rosh Hashanah stuff tomorrow night, but just the way things work. I celebrate a sweet new year by talking about these ideas that I care about.
My real question is, you talked about mobs shutting down conservatives. Many of these, I think, were funded by NGOs. NGOs are funded by billionaires, and it seems to me that many of these NGOs are in violation of the mandate that NGOs have been given. I mean, they're supposed to promote the public health, and they don't. So could you address that, please?
Well, some of the NGOs are funded by taxpayer dollars, and that's been addressed by this administration. I think that kind of pipeline, the astroturfing of, the EPA gives money to people to lobby the EPA to do things that it wanted to do, and it wants to show political backup for it, that sort of thing, which is a problem. I am wary, there obviously needs to be oversight of, tax-exempt organizations, NGOs, that they're complying with their rules and regulations. That has to have a light touch, because I don't want to, define public interest in a way that is ideologically biased. So, a clear line is supporting political candidates of one way or another, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and as long as it's not taxpayer dollars that are paying for activism of various kinds, billionaires have the same rights as anyone else, and I've filed briefs as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, pushing back on a New Jersey investigative demand for donors to nonprofits, for example. Again, when government starts getting involved, I reach for my pocketbook and my pocket constitution.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. Appreciate your perspective. 2 questions. The first one is, would love to hear your thoughts about the recent outcry because of the Jimmy Kimmel show being pulled, and hearing that the FCC has crossed the line and the executive branch is also overreaching. And then the second is, what's your call to action for us at a local and a state level in North Carolina? Yes, sir, thank you.
I just recorded City Journal's podcast this morning on the lead issue was the Jimmy Kimmel imbroglio. And I think Brendan Carr, the chairman of the FCC, muddied the waters here. What went on here? And by the way, apparently Jimmy Kimmel's been reinstated. I think he's going to be on again tonight, tomorrow night, I don't know. Although not all of the affiliates are required to broadcast him. Look, what really went on here, and we have no evidence to the contrary, is the same thing that went on when Stephen Colbert was canceled by CBS earlier this year. It's an expensive show to produce. Ratings are in the tank. Apparently Kimmel's ratings are even lower than Colbert's. This is a network, a broadcast network, so it's supposed to appeal to a broad audience, and yet his kind of unfunny political sermonizing is more, of an MSNBC or niche podcast audience or something like that. And there are plenty of podcasts that have better ratings, that get more viewers or listeners than that show. My understanding is that the president of Disney, Bob Iger, has long wanted to get rid of Kimmel for various reasons, and use this as an excuse. So I think it's purely a business decision. He was afraid that Kimmel was going to go on that night and double down on what he said on Monday, so that sort of thing. Now, because Brendan Carr said, we can do it the easy way or the hard way, there are licenses involved, made it seem like the FCC was going to take certain kinds of action based not on whether there was going to be profanity or whether it was suitable for the public, but based on viewpoint. And that's a problem. I agree with Ted Cruz, who said we don't want the FCC, policing viewpoints or making decisions that, as President Trump said, they're all against me, so we have to take action against them. That's very dangerous. That's, whether you call it jawboning or whatever, that's a First Amendment problem. Now, the FCC does have regulatory authority over broadcast spectrum, radio, TV, that it doesn't over cable, over podcasts, over this event, when it's posted on YouTube or wherever you post it, right? And specifically, there's a public interest requirement. What does that mean? Well, in a certain sense, at least as applied, it's too vague, right? Over the years, that public interest authority has been used to justify the fairness doctrine. If you present a conservative voice, you have to have a liberal voice and vice versa, and other things that I think are problematic. And especially now, where most people do not get their information from the broadcast networks, that has to be looked at in a different way. Maybe we need to change the FCC's authorizing statute or get rid of the FCC altogether, or just maintain it to prevent porn from appearing during hours when school children are awake, or something like that, much more narrow than it has been historically. So those are my range of views on the Kimmel imbroglio. Oh, and also mention that those that are kind of most up in arms about this, generally on the left, don't really have a leg to stand on based on how they behaved when the shoe was on the other foot, and seem to be more upset to Kimmel's cancellation than to Charlie Kirk's assassination. But Americans have the right to be hypocrites, I suppose. More broadly, what's my call to action? Demand more of your elected officials, of your public trustees, right? For too long, trustees, regardless of whether they nominally had an R or a D after their name, sought these seats for some sort of prestige or nostalgia for their college years, or at places like large flagship institutions like this one's for choice football and basketball seats, right? That's just not good enough. Governors and other appointing authorities have to see trusteeships in the same way that they see appointments for, Deputy State Secretary of Health and all these other agenda-setting positions. Some governors have started to recognize that. I'm a DeSantis-appointed trustee at a public university in Florida, for example. So, demand more of those governing boards. And as alumni and donors, make your voice felt. Even if you're not a billionaire, deans and presidents, advancement offices, know that every email they receive represents, 10 or more times the number of alumni. They don't want their percentage of giving to go down. They don't want alumni to be unhappy. They don't want bad PR. So there are ways of, strategically getting involved. That organizations like this one are important in that way, even if you're not writing checks for tens of thousands and millions of dollars.
Hey, thanks. Please forgive and correct me if I misrepresented what you said earlier, but I was wondering if you could explain how this idea that the diversity in intellectual and ideological thought, if that's important in college campuses, how that's fundamentally incompatible with any form of DEI, considering that it has the capacity to promote ideological diversity by helping represent previously underrepresented groups of students.
So the dictionary definition of diversity means people from different backgrounds, different perspectives, that enriches the discourse. That's all to the good. But the way that DEI has been practiced is to self-select for a narrow range of views. It's been both more and less than identity-based preferences in admissions. It's been ideological systems and structures that talk about viewing everything through identity categories and power imbalances that are baked into systems that make them illegitimate, and therefore they have to be deconstructed and reconstructed according to a different privilege hierarchy or intersectional matrix. All sorts of things that, to say the least, do not jibe with classical liberal values of seeking objective truth and knowledge and open discourse, because certain perspectives are devalued because they come from a so-called privileged perspective and things like that. So is it important to encourage, both by the admissions office, by student services, and inside the classroom, diversity of views? Absolutely. But DEI structures and systems are antithetical to that vision of the learning process, of the educational process.
You've actually addressed something I was going to ask you, but I'll ask for some specifics. The topic being the gutlessness of the trustees, and Governor DeSantis's appointment, apparently of you, I know Christopher Rufo, at the new college in Florida. My understanding is you guys went in there at the trustee level and kicked everybody out and accepted the resignation of all the progressive, I'll call them, professors. And as a result, there is a very robust attendance students trying to get into that university. So that's one model of, I think, success. I'd be interested in your comment on that. The second would be the University of Austin in Texas, where they don't take over a university, which is what I think DeSantis did in a very bold move with your good help. But they create a university, kind of an interesting university that appears to be quite popular. But it goes back to the idea, and you touched on it, what can you do to get rid of trustees who have the ability to really create change?
So I'm not on the board of New College. I'm on the board of Florida Polytechnic University, and there are two other lawyers on the board, now three, there's just another guy added. And we joke that we're the DEI representatives on the board because we're the only ones without a STEM background. It's a purely STEM school. It's a wonderful school, and it's only 11 years old now. It's very well ranked in the Southeast, and it's expanding. If we just picked so the founding president served 10 years, and we were brought in part, the new trustees, to help with the presidential search and voting on the next president, for which the final vote was kind of contentious. It was 7-6. But so we're on our second president. If by the time of the end of our second decade it doesn't have a national brand, I think we'll have failed. But it's on a tremendous trajectory. So I'm for all of the above in terms of reform. Yes, taking over institutions. Yes, building new ones. Yes, having new centers within institutions. Like one that's here in Florida State and Arizona State and other places. Now the danger there is they can get co-opted in various ways, and there's mission creep, and gradually, as donors have found, they try to create some chair, and then for something and it gets taken over by something that's the exact opposite. So that's it's hard, but all of these things I think need to be tried because different things might work in different places. It's very hard to found a new institution. Right? The University of Austin, it's not just a matter of, buying real estate or, hiring professors. There's brand equity, right? The first couple, they're into their second class now, so they're sophomores and they're freshmen. They're currently going to school for free. But who knows, when they graduate, hopefully that's going to be a valued credential that's going to mean something to grad schools, to employers, things like that. They're making a bet on that. That brand value is, is very hard, as hard or harder to create than the physical structures and the professors and things like that. But it's all worth trying. And how do you pressure trustees? I think it's more, for public institutions, it's pressuring elected officials that appoint the trustees. And as well as exposing, as I talked about my colleague John Saylor's work, if trustees are doing stupid things, then, expose that, because shame and PR and all of that is actually worth a lot. In private institutions, it's much harder. And we've seen Ivy League institutions change the rules so that they become even more self-perpetuating trustee bodies, and it's hard to have competing slates and things like that. And so it's a much longer-term indirect process that's sort of subsumed in the overall pressure on the administration to change its policies in various ways. But it's governance of higher education institutions, and particularly given that in a lot of states, the university systems, whether through their healthcare providers or otherwise, are the largest employer, or in any event have a big impact on the state in various ways. And so the governance of these institutions is an important political issue that resonates come election season.
Well, I want to thank you so much, for a fantastic speech and wonderful Q&A. And obviously we want to thank you all for coming out here and being curious about what he has to say. And I will highly recommend this book. It's fascinating. I spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, and I learned a lot from Lawless, and I thank you for writing this book. And I thank the Free Speech Association for not only sponsoring this event, but many more to come, and thank you all.